welcome. As always, I'm so glad to see you. It's our community, you know, and I'm Mary Davidson, and we have such an interesting guest. I love to introduce you to the neighbors, and some of them is an introduction for me as well. And today's guest is Dr. Leesa Fanning, and Dr. Fanning was for 20 years the curator of contemporary art at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and she has just retired and is kind enough to spend some time with us discussing her book. And her book is so interesting because, whoop, I'm dropping everything here. Her book is The Encountering the Spiritual in Contemporary Art. And it is a large book, but full of, if you like art at all or would like to be a student of contemporary art, it is a wonderful explanation of many, many pieces of art and as it relates to the world around us. If you're interested in buying the book, it's either you can buy it on Amazon or in the gift shop at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. So welcome, Dr. Leesa Fanning.
Thank you, Mary.
It is always a pleasure. And I think I would like to start out and talk about, obviously, the subject, but your thesis is that the spiritual is everywhere in contemporary art.
Yes.
And yet, you also say that it is rarely acknowledged in scholarship or criticism. Why?
Well, it's really many different reasons. It's the art world, like you said, scholarship, and they want to pursue what they believe to be hard world, really tough issues, real issues that are definable. And so when you start talking about the spiritual in contemporary art, they associate it with religion, or they begin to think it might be a little bit like New Age art or the kind of kitschy art that you see in religious stores, which it isn't at all. And it's also something that isn't really taught or studied when you're in art school. So it's...
Well, you know, usually they talk about Eastern art and Western art.
Correct.
But your spirituality in contemporary art talks about art as a global idea.
Yes. Yes.
Not only Eastern and Western, but...
Yes, I tried to bring in as many different world cultures as I possibly could. Let's see, we have
indigenous.
We have African, I have
And
indigenous Australian Aboriginal,
yeah.
I have American Indian, I have examples of Sufism and works that are related to Buddhism and Taoism, and also works that are related to Judeo-Christian traditions.
Well, and we have a great deal to show and to discuss as we talk about the fact that your book presents art from diverse cultures, and you give them all an equal status. I mean,
Exactly.
you're not saying this is more interesting for you and something you need to learn about, and this is, well, by the way. You have given them all equal status, and it moves beyond the notions of a center and a periphery.
That's right, yes.
See,
Yes.
I think that's where art should be, I think.
Oh, it's definitely the state of the art world right now. It is global. There are art fairs all around the world.
Well, and you celebrate the plurality and the global nature of contemporary art. And we have a number of pieces that we could present to you that show that plurality of art that is so very important today. So, major essays, you have essays in here as well.
Correct. There are 6 guest author essays. I wrote 2 essays, a really long introduction, and then an essay on contemporary abstract spiritual art, because that is definitely a trend. And then I invited guest authors who specialized in, for example, African art, Sufi-related art, and so on, to talk about those cultures.
Well, and you talk in your book and in your talks about it, that contemporary art, the spiritual, provides an alternative to the main currents
Yes.
that are presented and the interpretations that are prevalent in contemporary art.
Well, so much of the scholarship done today really focuses on trends that there are many of them, but I would describe them as people are really interested in politics, the environment, the economy. These are subjects in art, race, gender. It's all very, very prominent. And a lot of scholars never really have studied the spiritual, so they like to focus on what they know about, what interests them. And when you take on concepts like transcendence and the ineffable, these are things that take a long time of study, and that vocabulary is outside the range of really what they're interested in.
Well, and I would suggest to you that your book and your theories on contemporary art try to expand the mind.
Thank you. I hope so.
Well, we can always hope. Yes. As you present your subject. I want to talk about, you talk about the golden ratio, and let's talk about the cover of this book.
Yes.
As we talk about the golden ratio in art. Would you, there it is, talk about that just a little bit.
Sure. This is something that no one would probably know about the book by looking at it, but the design of the book is inspired by the golden ratio or the golden mean. This is a series of proportions that have for a long time believed to be harmonious or even divine. You find them in a lot of sacred architecture, the proportions of the building, but then you also find the golden mean or the golden section in nature, in the spacing and placement of the way that a pine cone is formed, and also in flower petals and the way that they're attached to the flowers. So it's a pervasive form, and the book design is based on that.
I think that's so interesting. And see, that is something that, I mean, that wouldn't have dawned on me, to tell you the truth. I mean, I have to be honest about it. So that's why it's so good to talk to somebody who is knowledgeable in the field and wants to talk about something like that, because I learn something new every day, and I guess that's... You talk about art being the entity that changes the world, and we've tried to produce for you art from different artists in this era that Dr. Fanning feels that fit in this category, and Wolfgang Lieb is the artist that we're going to talk about as the artist that changes the world.
Well, yes, I really think that so many of the artists do really want to change the world with their art. Lieb has made a piece that is the ziggurat piece that you see in the lower right corner there. That's a beeswax ziggurat, and it's placed in a very important cathedral or church. It's San Apollinaire in Clas Ravenna, that ziggurat is. And you'll see on the floor a placement of ships, like brass ships that have rice around them. And in that particular piece, I know a story that the artist told me, and the bishop worked with Wolfgang and a curator, and he initially agreed to the project to place Wolfgang's ziggurat in San Apollinaire, but then he changed his mind. He said that's a pagan form. It's a ziggurat. It comes from Mesopotamia. And also, they didn't at the time really understand that he had very limited people coming to the church. It's mostly tourists who come, and he felt that maybe the ziggurat would draw even more tourists. So he said no, he wouldn't do it. But then he agreed. And over time, as he watched Wolfgang work, he began to understand how Wolfgang worked, and he began to understand more and more about the art. Now, they didn't speak the same language, so they couldn't talk to each other. And over the process of the installation of this ziggurat, he came to understand how important it was and how Wolfgang worked and what his art meant. And so, to make his feelings clear to Wolfgang, what he did in the end is he brought out a very special blown glass lamp, and he lit it on the altar, and he signaled to Wolfgang that, here, I'm doing this for you. This is my apology to you. And then he later took Wolfgang to a very remote place in the church where they keep sacred vestments. And again, they couldn't speak. So he brought out a vestment, and the vestment was a beautiful silk garment with bees that were embroidered on it, and he showed it to Wolfgang. Again, another this offer of, I understand your art now. So in this instance, Wolfgang's art changed the bishop's mind, and he became an advocate for contemporary art. So
See, I think there are two threads to pull out there.
yes,
One is art in and of itself is a language.
yes,
That to me comes through.
truly,
The second one is that we cannot change the world in big lumps.
correct.
It is changed one by one.
One
by
person at a time. One person at a time.
And the ziggurat is a good example of that, because that was the one person.
right.
You know, and I think art is something beyond oneself, because I think the fact that art is a language unto itself changes our interior in many ways.
Yes.
And so that too is important. And so the spirituality of that art is incorporated in all of that. So you talk about spiritual motifs, and we're not talking particularly about religious motifs. We're talking about spiritual, and that's different than religion. So you talk about the fact that spiritual motifs manifest themselves in the process of the making. And we have an artist that will show that as well.
Absolutely. Maybe I should talk about Anselm Kiefer's work,
That's fine.
Maria. Maria is a painting of a monumental winged entity that is rising toward the moon and toward an orb. And the word Maria is written in cursive above, at the very top of the work. And this particular motif is an example of an artist he's very interested in the Virgin Mary, but he's combining and hybridizing different forms and creating something unique and original that is entirely his own. And you'll notice that the body of this monumental creature has at its center the artist's palette. That's a stand-in for the artist himself. And so the idea is that Maria is taking him, carrying him heavenly as this monumental entity sort of rises toward the heavens.
Well, and again, I think the artist was able, through the spirituality of creation, to expand his message.
Exactly.
That's number one. And number two, I think that often, if we look carefully, the soul of the artist emerges in the work.
Always.
See? And I think that often we look at contemporary art, and I have to be honest here, we look at contemporary art and we think, what? But if we look deeper and read something about what the artist was feeling and doing, then emerges within us an expansion and an appreciation of something that's a little different.
Yes, art can move us outside ourselves to have other experiences.
Yeah, and see, that to me is the beauty of art.
Right.
One of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk in your book, this I found extremely interesting. You talk about the theme. There are 4 themes in the book, and they are, in essence, schematic categories. So can we start with the first category?
Sure.
And you talk about that as sources of inspiration, the interconnection of humans. And to me, the world, we are no longer citizens of Leawood or Overland Park or Shawnee or Merriam.
Right.
We're not citizens of Kansas, we are citizens of the world.
Yes.
And I think we all are interconnected. So if we can use art to underscore that theory of connectedness, that's really important. So again,
Yes.
we can show what that interconnectedness means through a piece of art.
Right.
To me, that's wonderful. And I think what you've chosen, I can't remember, is that for
It's-
Aboriginal women?
No, the first artist sources of inspiration image is by an artist named YZ Kami, who has made a painting called Daya's Hands.
Oh, that's right.
Yes,
Yeah.
and what it is it's a pair of praying hands. And so Kami's sources of inspiration with this particular piece always intrigued me because obviously it's inspired by Durer's praying hands, the very famous traditional object of art by Durer that just shows praying hands.
Well, and he was a very traditional artist.
Yes, but however, this pair of praying hands has a totally has many, many sources just beyond that, because Kami, even though he's of Persian descent, is a follower of Sai Baba. So he goes to India and he studies Sai Baba in a form of Hinduism. And of course, in India, this gesture is namaste, and it means my soul bows to yours. So it has that meaning for Kami as well. So Kami is really drawing on a wide variety of sources of inspiration. He studies all kinds of different philosophies too.
Isn't that wonderful?
Mm-hmm.
I just, it sort of is difficult to wrap one's arms around this whole notion, I think, and how nice to have that explanation. So the next time we look at a piece of contemporary art, we might see something entirely different.
Yes.
I think the second category is the artist's body of work as a signifier of spiritual content. And you make the point that the body is the basis for being in the world that can heighten the perception and mindfulness of the oneness of mind, body, and spirit.
Yes.
Who did you choose?
Oh, well, in this particular instance, I'm choosing Anselm Kiefer and a painting called Falling Stars. And in this work, Kiefer is depicting himself. He's lying on the ground outside, and the cosmos is above him, a very, very dark night sky, and it's full of stars, and even some stars seem to be falling on him. Well, his pose, lying flat, is a yoga pose. It's a savasana pose, and that pose relates to birth and death and rebirth. And if you look at this painting very, very carefully, there is a diagonal mark that moves from one of the stars above down to the artist's forehead, his third eye in Hindu philosophy. So Kiefer is depicting his body, showing himself in this pose, communing with the cosmos, using his body to convey the spiritual content.
It's a magnificent concept. I think the whole thing is just, it opens for me a new world that I have to be honest, had not considered.
Thank you.
And so I thank you for that. The third one is materials, form, color. Sound, color, and shape awakens our senses.
Yes, I believe that materials, form, and color have their own inherent spiritual meaning, and that we can find spiritual meaning just through forms and color. For example, James Lee Byers' work, it is a beautiful sphere. It's a meter high, a meter in diameter rather, of 3,333 roses. And you encounter this in a room, and immediately the materials and the form and the color, they convey spiritual content, because you become aware, if you see this over time, of these red roses turning rusty brown. So the materials are telling us about life and death and the ephemeral quality of beauty, and also the sphere-shaped form for James Lee Byers meant wholeness and perfection and unity, and he connected the sphere shape to Pythagoras and mathematical perfection.
So the measurement of this sphere is important?
Not so much the measurement, although I would say the scale of it, the size of it, being a meter tall, it definitely commands you. It gets your attention.
Oh, for sure.
Yes.
And what happens to it as the flowers start to die?
Well,
what happens ultimately to the piece?
Oh, well, the piece stays intact. They're attached, but so they will turn brown,
Right.
and the roses will stay in place. And then when you're completely finished with the exhibition, of course, then you destroy
That's
the
what I
piece.
was asking,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
made again for every time it's shown.
I think that's really interesting. And the second piece is?
The second piece is a work by Sonam Dolni, and it consists of, it's a floor piece, and it consists of 49 Tibetan monks' robes that have been folded very carefully and placed in this square-like configuration. And in the center of it, looking down into the center, you'll see 9 white forms that are called satsas. And so the artist, Sonam Dolni, she's Tibetan. She walked out of Tibet when she was 5 years old, and she wanted to use used monks' robes that were cast off because they retain the presence of the monks, their physical presence, their DNA, their lives of perpetual prayer and meditation carry this meaning with them. And then the satsa in the center they were made from a mold, and they're used from Tibetan worship. And the mold was the only object that Sonam Dolni and her family were able to carry out of Tibet. So she includes these forms in the center of this piece.
But I think what's so interesting here is the concept that their soul, if you will, or their, not so much their life, but their being, their
presence.
Their presence
Yes.
is in that cloth.
It's in that cloth
that they wore. And I think that that's a concept that materialists
Yes.
it's hard for them to grasp that, I
Yes.
think. And isn't that a wonderful expansion of the mind if you can move from being absolutely materialistic about everything and say, are you kidding me? And to the point at which you can say, you know, I understand that because I have clothing, that I have had for a long time.
Yes.
And you become, I call it become attached to. But I think really what happens is that I become part of that, or it becomes part of me. I'm not sure which way
Yes.
we go, but I think that's...
Well, even for people who aren't so spiritually inclined, there's the whole concept of your DNA you have left your DNA on those clothes, in those clothes. So even scientifically, essence is there.
Creating art as a spiritual process, and you say art and life are one and the same.
Yes, exactly.
And you have chosen two pictures, two pieces of art to talk about.
This is Shirazé Hushiari's piece called Echo, and her spiritual process, her art-making process, is incredibly spiritual. To make this painting, it's very large. It's 18 feet long, and it's in 2 pieces.
That's a big one.
It is. It is. And she put blue pigment all over the canvas, and then when that process was finished, she laid it on the ground, and then she lies on top of the canvas, and you can see in the detail of the image these little pencil marks, the little tiny pencil marks that look just like the filigree. Well, those began in her earlier career as Arabic calligraphy, a phrase, I am not. It's a Sufi phrase, meaning breathing in and breathing out, breath and exhaling, or life and death. And as she began to work so many years in this process, her writing became a kind of a shorthand. So this painting, these swirling forms that are made by the pencil marks that you can see, is a meditative process, and the painting probably took over a year for her to complete. She's lying very close to the canvas, drawing for hours and hours and hours to make these whirling forms that when you see them from a distance, it's like you're looking at the earth from a satellite photograph of
Her mind,
and
really,
clouds.
of her mind, really.
Yes, of the mind too, yes.
I think that's... Now, you have two, I think, in this category that you
I-
wanted to discuss.
Yes, I do. And the second one in Art Making a Spiritual Process is a work by Megan O'Brien called Sky Blanket. And she is a Kwakwaka'wakw and Haida and Irish. You can see this robe. It's a combination of a chilkat robe and a raven's tail robe, and you see Megan, who's actually wearing the robe on the right. It's made out of mountain goat wool, and she has to collect the mountain goat wool and clean it, and then in that stage of the art making process, it is like a cloud. It's like vapor, and so she uses a traditional technique of rolling or spinning the wool on her thigh, to bring it down into a form that she can weave with. And as she weaves, she meditates and centers her body, and the robe just emerges through that process. She used to count the warp and weft. She doesn't anymore. She's a snowboarder, almost Olympic talent, and seeing her snowboard, she just touches the mountain as she goes down, and she does that by centering, and that's the same way that she weaves. So as she weaves, she describes her process going from this cloud-like wool to the skein of wool that she weaves with to the robe as the condensation of spirit, because the robe itself is densely woven and heavy, and she describes herself wearing it as being cloaked in spirit.
And it has not only changed her senses because she no longer uses a pattern. It's a pattern of the mind and
It's a pattern
body.
of the mind and body.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, I'm going to present to you an issue that may be a large one. Can you pick a piece or pieces that encompass all four themes?
Oh, of course I can. In fact, categories are used to help us focus, to limit but focus us, and all of these artists could be discussed across all four of the categories we just talked about. One of my favorite ones is an artist named Wolfgang Leib, and
Now, we looked at one of his pieces
we
earlier.
did. We looked at the ziggurat piece, and we have four different images by Leib. The one in the upper left is made out of rice and pollen, and the one on the upper left is rice and pollen. The one on the right is a pollen field.
And it took him, what, 15 years?
It took him 15 years of
to gather
collecting.
that pollen.
Yes, to gather that pollen.
Now, there's commitment for you.
There is commitment. The image on the lower left is called a milkstone, and you can't really see it in this image, but the milkstone is hollowed out, a very shallow depression, and he has poured milk in it, a living substance, and it stays like that the entire day till the end of the day until it's emptied out. And then the image on the lower right is that ziggurat again. And so first, Wolfgang's forms are, take his ziggurat form. His forms are always very simple. They're archetypal. The ziggurat form speaks to transcendent, this form that climbs up toward the heavens. His colors are pure white and yellow, which is very, very radiant. His materials are materials of nature, rice, milk, pollen. His art-making process is very spiritual. As you said, he spent 15 years in solitude every season for 15 years collecting pollen from a field around his house in Germany. He lives in a very remote part of Germany and prefers his solitude. And his art-making process, this process of sifting pollen onto the floor, is meditative, repetitive, ritual. You see his body making art. He's on the floor, humble, connected to the earth. And finally, his sources of inspiration are incredibly vast. Hinduism, Christian mysticism, and Buddhism reign all supreme in Wolfgang's thinking.
And there you have the four themes, the schematic categories of the spirituality of contemporary art. And as I thank Dr. Fanning for this wonderful enlightenment, but for me, I would have to say that in their art, with their third eye, the connection with the mysterious and powerful force is with the artist in their art.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. And thanks again, Dr. Fanning.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon again, because it's our community and we have to keep in touch with our neighbors.